Alright guys, I don't exactly know what happened over the course of the past week. I kinda took a little bit of a break off of covering Switch 2 stuff just because I had too many things going on in the real world, only to come back and find out that all of a sudden people think that the Nintendo Switch 2 is going to be home of the third-party games. And well, I can't have people going out there spreading misinformation and making the wrong assumptions based off of incorrect data. So I figure it's worth making a video on how you can track some of this information in case you want to rebuttal some of these arguments that people are making online. Now, before we even get into the Nintendo Switch 2 stuff, the first thing that's very confusing to me is the fact that people get offended when you tell them Nintendo is a first-party console, as if it's an insult and it downplays what the Nintendo games are. On the contrary, I think Nintendo is an excellent first-party console, and as a Nintendo fan myself, I think Nintendo games are some of the most fun games I've ever played, and not everybody listening will agree with that, but that's my opinion. And quite frankly, I thought it was something that was well understood amongst the entirety of the Nintendo fandom. And I don't know if it's because there aren't that many first-party games that have been announced for the Nintendo Switch 2 yet, or if Nintendo fans just hate hearing me say that because they want to disagree with everything that I say. But objectively, just looking at the data, the Nintendo Switch 1 was overwhelmingly a first-party device. And I mean, I've already kind of done this, but the first 23 games on the top 100 list were all first-party games. And not just that, of those 100 games, 79 of them were first-party titles. And if you want to delve even deeper into that, there has been 1.415 billion copies of games shipped for the platform. I think the top 30 of that makes up roughly 1/3 of all of those numbers. And like I said, of that top 30, most of it is first party. Like, there's no argument here. This isn't to say that people don't buy third-party games on the Nintendo Switch. I'm just saying from how much it favors the first-party titles, it's almost irrelevant. The breadwinner, the moneymaker, the reason people buy Nintendo consoles are for the first-party games. It's clear as mud. And it's something that people should be proud of, not something that people should belittle and put down. You buy third parties on the stronger consoles, and then you play the first party games on Nintendo. That's how it works. And early signs show that it's similar for the Nintendo Switch 2. And it shows that despite the fact that the Nintendo Switch 2 has yet to release that many first party titles. And Nintendo themselves have been pushing and marketing third-party titles to heights that we haven't seen before at the start of a console launch for Nintendo. They aren't even announcing their games. There is a massive marketing push for third-party games to show that they will run on the Nintendo Switch 2, and while most of them do not run that well, some of them run okay. But this isn't about the ports. We're not going to talk about how Star Wars Outlaws has become a flag that Nintendo fans have carried, who had that for their 2025 bingo card. We're here to talk about sales numbers. Now, the only way people can actually gather data on sales is by using official sources. But there are some sources that are a little bit more official in their estimates, we'll say that, and there are others that aren't quite there. The realest way you can get actual data and numbers from anybody is Nintendo themselves, or the publishers of the games, obviously, because they're third-party titles. Beyond that, you have official companies like Circana that tracks data, you have Famitsu in Japan that guesses on things, and they're pretty good about it sometimes. But even amongst those things, it's very hard to get direct and accurate information. These companies don't necessarily consider digital sales. Some of them don't even tell you sales numbers, they just give you rankings. But there are absolutely ways to kind of get a feel for how well something is doing based off of different retailers' websites. And that's obviously in addition to all this data that is being collected. So we'll start with the most obvious one because I think it's the one that's painting the narrative that's making people assume things that might not necessarily be correct. And I'm sure you guys have seen this being shared online quite a bit, but there are screenshots that go around that show the bestsellers that are ranked on the Nintendo eShop. So the way the current eShop works right now is that if you were to click on bestsellers, it'll rank the games that have the most downloads over the course of the past 72 hours. This is obviously much better than it used to be on the Switch 1. I think it used to be 48 hours, and it might have went based off of the most downloads, whereas now it goes based off of the most revenue, and that kind of allows it to filter out all of the slop that people were downloading that nobody really wanted to see when they clicked on bestsellers. So, unsurprising to anybody, the bestsellers right now will always drastically favor the games that just came out over the past few days. This is why when something like Madden came out, everybody was like, see, football fans are buying this on the Switch too, and they're ignoring it on the other consoles. Or how in the first couple days after Outlaws came out, it seemed like it was just very popular because it was on the bestsellers list. And it's like, of course it is. It just came out and there aren't many games to compare it to. Silksong, on the other hand, is a game that's going to continue to sell well. That's why after a few days, it's still sitting on the top of that list. The point point is that this bestsellers list, while yes, it is a good indication of a specific point in time, it's not always the best way to gauge the long-term success of a game on a console. For example, Welcome Tour was like in the top 5 or top 10 when the game first came out too, because when the Switch 2 launched, there weren't that many games to download, so obviously Welcome Tour is going to be up there. But now if you go on bestsellers, Welcome Tour is nowhere to be seen. Another good example of this is Cyberpunk. That's a game that everybody treated as an excellent Switch 2 port, and it's going to do great, and that's what's going to get people to buy the Switch 2, third-party games, yada yada yada. You gotta scroll all the way down to find it there. Another one that everybody praised was Street Fighter. Can't even find it anywhere. Yakuza is nowhere to be seen. Sonic Shadow Generations are there. Hogwarts Legacy is there. And actually, I think Hogwarts is one that deserves praise. I'm surprised that it made it up there, but again, this is only over the course of the past 36 hours, and there are not that many games to actually download on the device. But if you notice, there are games that remain close to the top regardless. Donkey Kong Bonanza is there. Mario Party Jamboree. Mario & Rabbids is not a first-party title, but it's got Mario's face on it. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe and Smash Brothers. It's obvious. These are games that will be close to that bestsellers list regardless of when you search it, and they will remain in that area of that list for years to come. And it's not to say that third-party games will not be in that digital bestsellers list, but oftentimes it'll be because there's either a game in that franchise coming out, there'll be a very good sale, it might be a very affordable indie title, for example. But for the most part, this is not the best way to gauge how good a game is doing, because it's without context. You don't know what other games are available to buy, you don't know exactly how many copies are being sold and downloaded even. I mean, a few days ago, you would have assumed that Star Wars Outlaws is one of the best-selling games on the Nintendo Switch 2, but now you look at it and it's already dropped down on the list, and it's gonna keep going down. But something like Silksong? No, that sits right up there. Deservedly so. And if you notice, it's not just a Switch 1 version. You got the Switch 1 version, you got the Switch 2 version, and then you got the old Hollow Knight, the initial game, all sitting there. Those are games that are going to remain fairly popular. Now, it could be wrong on this one, but I think these eShop numbers are region specific, so they might vary depending on which region you're in, obviously. So, for example, when Madden comes out, it'll be doing very well in America for the first weekend when it drops, but it won't necessarily rank too highly overseas. Again, there's a lot of context. It depends on what else is coming out at the same time. It depends on how long the game's been out. There's all these different ways where games can come in and out of the different eShops and be on the bestsellers lists. But a very important thing to note right now, in my opinion, is that this is the best that the third parties are going to look on a lot of these shops because of just how massive of a push Nintendo is doing for third parties going into the launch of the Nintendo Switch 2. Once we start getting more and more first-party games lined up for the Nintendo Switch 2, this eShop list will look very different. So this is the best it's gonna look. And that goes the same for some of the next things that I'm going to look at. Another way to quickly track things is with Circana. Matt Piscatella will release monthly data on hardware and game sales. You don't always get the full picture. You don't necessarily know exactly how many units are being sold for anything specific. A lot of times it'll just be a ranking. But if you read through some of the conversations he says when people ask him questions in the forums or over on different social networking sites, sometimes he'll give you a little bit more clarification. So for example, we know that in July of 2025, Donkey Kong Bonanza was in third place for best games that were sold that month. And we also know that the first two were EA Sports College Football 26 and EA Sports MVP Bundle 2025. So it makes it seem like, oh wow, Donkey Kong Bonanza is like up there just behind EA Sports College Football. And we know that game is doing well because that was like the best-selling sports game of 2025. So the 2026 variation must be very good. But then like you look at the context of what he's saying and he's like, yeah, well, those were like way ahead of Bonanza. Bonanza was in third place. And even if you look at the list, you can see which games are new, and those ones have the bump for being the new game. But then amongst those, what sticks out are the most popular games. Your Call of Duties, your Minecrafts, your Forza Horizons, the games that will always remain in that ranking regardless. Now you can look at this July chart, right? You can tell that Donkey Kong Bonanza is the best-selling game from Nintendo for that month. Now keep in mind, Nintendo also does not share their digital data information with Circana, so the best you could do is kind of gauge it. This doesn't necessarily mean that all of these games sold better than Nintendo games, but we know that overwhelmingly Donkey Kong Bonanza was definitely the best seller, and that most of the other games that are on this list were not on the Nintendo Switch 2. But Matt Piscatella also provides platform-specific games, and you can see what's physically selling well for Nintendo in the States during the month of July. So you can kind of get a feel for the top 10 list, and you notice that what's second place on this list does not make it on the overall top 20 list. And not just that, we can see that Super Mario Party Jamboree outsold Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 and 4, but on the list of all platforms for the software charts, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4 4 was 4th place just behind Donkey Kong Bonanza, and Mario Party Jamboree was not on this list at all. So it's probably safe to assume that Tony Hawk's Pro Skater did much better on other platforms than it did on the Nintendo one, but again, you can't exactly conclude that. Regardless, when you look at the sales for July, you see a bunch of first-party Nintendo titles, with Hogwarts Legacy still doing very well, credit to that one, but it's doing worse than Smash Bros. Ultimate, it's doing worse than the 2 Zelda games, the Mario Kart World standalone, this is not even the bundle with the console, doing worse than Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, and Mario Party Jamboree and Bonanza. So even though there is a third-party title that seems to be doing well despite the fact that it wasn't released this month, that being Hogwarts Legacy, it's still not doing nearly as well as all of these first-party games. And some of them are very old and didn't even receive any Switch 2 editions. And mind you, you can also look up the June list for this Circana data. Cyberpunk 2077 was the number 2 best-selling game in June for Nintendo consoles, and it immediately dropped off. Street Fighter 6, Rune Factory, and Bravely Default, they both did not continue making it to the next month. But Hogwarts did, and yeah, that one definitely has some legs. So by using the data that we saw in the eShop earlier and looking at the Circana data over here, we still see the same patterns. A third-party game will come out, it'll be popular, and then it's gonna just die out and not gonna matter anymore because there are first-party games, and that's what people want to buy on the Nintendo consoles. And once again, this is a very similar pattern to what we saw with all of the Switch 1 games. And you're going to be seeing similar things if you look at the European data trackers. Some countries will provide more details from other, but these patterns are generally the same across the board. I think we'll look at Famitsu, we'll look at the Japanese numbers. The launch week for the Nintendo Switch 2 had games closer to the top like Rune Factory, Yakuza 0, Street Fighter 6, and Bravely Default were up there in the top 20, as well as Cyberpunk. And these are just the Switch 2 versions. You can also find their Switch 1 versions on there as well, and we can assume that at least some people for the Switch 1 are buying these games for the Switch 2. Either because they don't want a game keycard, or because they just bought a Switch 2, never had a Switch 1, so they're buying Switch 1 games. There's a plethora of reasons why. Obviously, in this top 10 list, the 2 Legend of Zelda Switch 2 edition games are sitting up there as well, and it shouldn't really be a surprise to anybody that they're outselling most of the Nintendo Switch 2 games. Fast forward a month from that, Yakuza 0 and Rune Factory are still in the top 20 discussion, they're both out of the top 10. Tamagotchi Plaza is still there after releasing the week prior, but all of these games are being outsold by Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, Super Mario Party Jamboree, and this is before the Switch 2 edition even comes out. Animal Crossing sits in 7th place, and then still in the top 20 you have the 2 Legend of Zelda games. But obviously by this point in time, some of the games that are praised the most for the Nintendo Switch 2, like Cyberpunk, like Street Fighter, they're nowhere to be seen in the top 30s. The only games from the launch weekend that were still there a month later were Rune Factory and Yakuza, which is well, and I think that's a testament to how popular they are in Japan. Although I do think by this point in time they might have gotten price cuts, but either way I think that doesn't affect it that much. Outside of that, the remaining Switch 2 launch titles that still remain on this list are Mario Kart World, the 2 Zelda titles, and Welcome Tour. All of those other games that launched are long gone by now, and keep in mind the 30th best game on this list was Donkey Kong Country's Returns, which only sold 1,000 copies. Okay, we're gonna jump up to August 17th because this covers 2 weeks of data. It was during the holidays where sales were pretty high. Top 10, you have Mario Kart World, you have Donkey Kong Bonanza, Demon Slayer, which is a Switch 1 game, Minecraft for the Switch 1, which seems to always be in this list, that's almost as popular as the first-party titles, Mario Party Jamboree, Gradius for the Switch 1 that had just come out on that week, and it was actually the only new title to make this list, and then you have the popular games, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, Animal Crossing, Super Mario Party Jamboree, the Switch 1 version that many people used and upgraded, and then Tamagotchi Plaza is still there. Over the span of that 2-week window, they did break down the software sales, and by this point in time, games like Yakuza 0, which were popular in Japan, had completely fallen off. Rune Factory is no longer there. The only June games that still make it to this list are Minecraft and Tamagotchi Plaza. And again, those are also Switch 1 games, so you don't really know if people are playing them on the Switch 2 or the Switch 1. But for the first party, you have Mario Kart World, the Legend of Zelda games, and Clubhouse 51. All first-party titles. And then for the July games, which are more recent, so you'd expect those ones to still stick around, you only have Donkey Kong Bonanza, you have the Jamboree title, and I think that's it, actually, for the Switch 2 titles. So like all of these third-party titles that people have supposedly been saying are going to be doing very well and they're going to carry the Switch 2 to new heights are all gone by this point in time. They're not selling enough to be relevant in the discussion. And this doesn't mean they're not selling, but again, when I make the comments like, oh, the Switch 2 is primarily for first party, this is what I'm talking about. I'm not pulling things out of thin air. It's very clear in the sales patterns, and this is similar to what we're going to be seeing on the Switch 2 going forward, because this is what we saw on the Switch 1. And as a reminder, these are brand new third-party Switch 2 games that are for the most part competing with nothing. There is no first-party titles that are really brand new. They're competing with ports, with Switch 2 editions, and most importantly with Switch 1 games, last-gen titles. Last-gen titles that came out years ago, I might add. So this is the best chance that third-party titles have to actually get a push on the console. This is why there were statements from different third parties who were like, I did not expect the launch to be that bad for our games, because they were like, this is our chance. We're gonna win. We're gonna make some sales. Now, the next part is kind of my way of tracking different types of sales numbers as well. I haven't been shy about it. I'm very mesmerized by the concept that the Nintendo Switch 2 is not sold out. I'm like the only person I know that said this thing will be readily available within a month or two after it was launched, and everybody else was saying you'd be lucky to find it after the holidays. And it was very obvious to me because I could see how much the Switch 2 was selling for with the scalpers. I could see how long it was taking for different units to move once they get into the stores. And likewise, before they announced the July sales, I predicted that the Switch 2 would have between 2.1 and 2.2-ish million sold, I think, in America. And it ended up being 2.08, so I was pretty close. So while my methodology may not be foolproof, it is somewhat accurate. But you know, it's only really worth tracking if you're somebody that's very passionate about this, because by no means is it easy to keep track of this stuff. So I found that Target.com is one of the best ways to give you an idea for how well something is actually selling. If you search Nintendo Switch 2 games, you sort it by the bestseller, you can kind of get a feel. Generally speaking, you won't always get the actual quantity of something that's sold in a specific month, but you'll get an idea, and if you're lucky, you might actually get the direct number that you want. Target and most of these systems actually track based off of the past 30 days. So if you search Switch 2 games and you sort by bestseller, you can see that the Switch 2 bundle has sold the best. Donkey Kong Bonanza is the second best. When I was tracking it last month, which the Switch 2 did probably better in July versus August, the Switch 2 was over 120,000 units sold. So that discrepancy can be very large. But again, this is not necessarily to give you accurate numbers, it's to just give you an idea of how things are going. And mind you, the list can sometimes be wrong. Sometimes you'll find something that's sold 2,000 plus in the past month that's slightly ahead of something that's sold fewer than it. And I think it's because when you go based off of bestsellers, it's not only about actual products sold, sometimes it's about products that end up in people's carts. They're clicked on a lot, they might move up on the list. But again, this is all just to give you a general idea. So if you skip right past Donkey Kong Bonanza, we see that Kirby and the Forgotten Land sold 2,000 copies in the last month. This is the Switch 2 edition. Jamboree sold 2,000 copies in the last month. And then in third place, you have Madden 26, which also sold 2,000 copies. This looks good for Nintendo, right? The fourth best-selling game from Target was a third-party title. If you scroll down a bit more, you get to the 1,000 plus sold, and you see Grand Bazaar, and then finally you get to Mario Kart World and Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, and then Cyberpunk, which is making an appearance there as well. And you get the idea. Eventually, you jump and see Star Wars Outlaws, which is at 500 plus over the past month. That is probably going to be much higher on the list very soon, because this is based off of the past 30 days, and Star Wars Outlaws only came out a week ago. So in theory, it should move up a bit, but right now all we see is that it's 500 plus, and usually the games sell best at the first week that they're out, so it might go up to like 1,000, maybe 2,000 plus by the end of the month. And as you move down, you'll find Street Fighter 6 with 800 plus sold, Hogwarts Legacy with 700 plus sold, and again, these are only the Switch 2 versions of these games, and that's kind of important to note, because if you go to the compatibility list and you turn on the games that are available for the Switch 1 as well, all of a sudden you find out that Mario Kart 8 Deluxe and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate are all outselling most of these third-party titles. And not just that, we thought that Madden 26 was doing pretty well because it's selling almost as good as the Jamboree Switch 2 edition, but when you turn on the Switch 1 compatibility list, you also see that Mario Party Jamboree sold better than both of those, which means in the month of August, where the Madden sales would realistically be the highest, it was outsold by almost 2 times by Super Mario Party Jamboree, which is by most people considered the worst of the Switch 2 edition first-party titles. And again, as you go through these lists, you're finding all of the same patterns. A new game comes out, it looks kind of good compared to like the worst selling first-party title, but then as time goes on, they completely disappear, and those worst selling first-party titles are still on the bestsellers list. They remain there because Nintendo games are overwhelmingly more popular on Nintendo consoles, and that's going to remain the same. That doesn't mean that games like Minecraft and even Hogwarts Legacy are not going to sell well, but those third-party games are not going to be the reason people buy the Switch 2 for. Think of all of the third-party games that you've seen people make posts about, you've seen people push, you've seen people make videos about, and try to really push how great they run on the Nintendo Switch 2. Think of some of the best ones, like WWE, everybody was talking about that. The sports titles, some people were hating on it, but how many posts did you see online where people were like, this is a great way to play these games? Cyberpunk 2077, people were acting like this was a first-party Nintendo game. And likewise, they're doing the same thing with Star Wars Outlaws. They're going to do the same thing with whatever game comes to this console. A lot of that is done by people that are trying to push a narrative, whether it's because they're getting paid for it, whether it's because they're being provided free copies, or whether they actually work for the marketing division of these companies and they're told to infiltrate Twitter and Reddit and post pictures online. None of this stuff should be a surprise to us because we know that companies have marketers that work in these different social networks. And on top of all of that, you have Nintendo who's really trying to push parties, and that's why they're making surveys about game keycards. That's why they're so concerned about all this stuff. That's why they're withholding all of their first-party news. They want to give third parties a chance to flourish. All of this massive push for the third parties, and now, just by simply digging around on websites online, the only conclusion that I've come to is that Tamagotchi Plaza is pretty popular in Japan and Hogwarts Legacy is pretty popular over here. Aside from that, you have these games that are being sold and they're not nearly as popular as first-party titles, and they're not going to sell as well as first-party titles, no matter how much of a marketing push you see. I went to Target, I showed you those numbers, right? You can do the same thing if you go to the Walmart website. Go to Amazon, you'll find similar results. Best Buy, that one seems to be weird. It's like every time you refresh it, something else pops up. I usually don't like using Best Buy as a gauge because it always ends up being inconclusive, but I think you're starting to get the picture. You can pretty much gauge at least 50% of all the US sales just by using some of those websites, and I think more realistically it's like 90% if you add GameStop, for example. Actually, sometimes GameStop looks even worse because you'll find a used game that is no longer available still outselling the Switch 2 titles. But look, I think I've made my point pretty clear. And honestly, I'm not gonna lie, this feels like a big waste of everybody's time. Like, I'm not discovering anything new that you guys didn't know. People buy Nintendo games for first-party titles. There is a Nintendo Direct coming this week. Nintendo really wants to push the idea that third-party games are going to be carrying this console because they want to get that market. They want to get you to buy your third-party games on Nintendo because then they can make a lot more money. Their software sales, their year-over-year revenue is actually not as high as you'd think it would be because they don't get those yearly purchases that other consoles do. Those yearly COD games, those yearly Madden games. All of those third-party titles that people just re-up and buy the same thing every single year. So it's very important to them in order to get that money, which, again, they're gotta do what they gotta do. I understand it. I'm not saying like they're wrong for doing it. But that does not change reality. And the reality is that when you buy Nintendo, you're buying Nintendo for the first-party games, and most people are not buying their third-party games on the console. The statistics show that. The sales numbers show that. Even the early Switch sales numbers that were officially provided by Nintendo. 8.67 million games sold for the Nintendo Switch 2 through the end of June. 5.63 million of those games are Mario Kart World, obviously because most of them were bundled in. That means even if you remove Mario Kart from the list, in the month of June, there were like 3 million games that were sold, and all of the patterns indicate that the Zelda Switch 2 edition games were overwhelmingly selling better than a lot of the other ones, and heck, we know that Welcome Tour was selling better than a lot of the other games too. How much of that actually remains for third parties to fight over? There were a lot of third party games, and this is over the whole world. What is it, 1 or 2 million tops over the entirety of the month of June? We know that Hogwarts Legacy did well, and Cyberpunk picked up a decent amount too. But even with those 2 games, it's negligible at best. The third parties fight for the scraps. A few of them will stick out, but most of them do not shine on the Nintendo console. It's a waste of their time. Ubisoft went out of their way to put Star Wars Outlaws on the Nintendo Switch 2. They spent a lot of time on marketing, a lot of effort into making that game work on that console, and there's just been such a massive push for it between the Nintendo fandom as well as Ubisoft. This is the best chance a third-party title has to actually flourish and show what the Nintendo Switch 2 is capable of, and the only reason it's happening is because Ubisoft is desperate to get this game to be a success. And when other companies see that despite this time and effort and money that they put in order to get Switch 2 to run Star Wars Outlaws, they're all going to look at it and they're gonna laugh it off and be like, why would I waste my time on this? And it's going to be the exact same cycle that we saw with the Nintendo Switch 1, where the third-party titles were an afterthought. What were the third-party titles that everybody was amazed they could run on the Nintendo Switch 1? And until now, people speak very highly of them. I think it was like Witcher 3, Doom 2016, and was it one of the Red Dead Redemption games? None of those games are on the top 102 titles for the Nintendo Switch 1, which means none of them managed to sell 1 million copies. But Fitness Boxing sold 1 million, Bayonetta 3 and Metroid Prime Remastered both sold 1 million, Mario vs. Donkey Kong sold 1 million, even Game Builder Garage sold 1 million. Heck, Princess Peach Showtime managed 1.3 million. There's a specific type of audience that buys Nintendo consoles, and they're mostly interested in specific types of games. I don't know why we need to lie and pretend that's not the case.